So this lecture is going to be talking about sort of an introduction to environmental disasters and presenting it as a contrast with what we typically would refer to as a natural disaster. And hopefully by the end of this, I have convinced you that there's really no such thing as a natural disaster. Due to human influences, everything is now basically an environmental disaster. So let's talk about that in more depth. So what is a disaster? Let's start there. So a disaster, I think in our heads we have this kind of idea of what a disaster is, but the Red Cross and other, disaster relief organizations refer to a disaster, define a disaster as a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community or society and causes human, material, and economic or environmental losses that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope using its own resources. That's key. Though often caused by nature, and we'll talk about that, disasters can have human origins. So a disaster occurs when a hazard impacts on vulnerable people, and the vulnerability is an important part of this equation, right? So the combination of hazards, vulnerability, and inability to reduce the potential negative consequences of risk results in disaster. So if we think of this as an equation, we have the vulnerability coefficient plus the hazard coefficient. Okay, so how vulnerable is a community? How bad is the hazard? Divide that by the capacity of a community or a country or a state or a city, whatever, to respond. And the combination of that, if it passes a certain threshold, right, then we define that as a disaster. This is sort of the textbook academic definition. Obviously, in our lives, in the world, we have understanding of what a disaster is, but this is kind of how we can think about this empirically. So let's talk about each of those things. So vulnerability is the capacity, and specifically the diminished capacity of an individual or a group, like a city, a population within a city, a country, etc., to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a hazard, whether it be natural or man-made, and we'll talk about the difference between natural and man-made in a moment. So the concept of vulnerability is relative and dynamic, so things can change. Things can be vulnerable, and then they can be made less vulnerable, for example. So some things that make populations vulnerable. What are some things that make populations vulnerable? I want you to think about them, and then we'll talk about them together. But there are many things that make populations vulnerable, and so I want you to think about those right now, and then we'll have a chat about them later. Okay, a hazard. A hazard is a naturally occurring or a technological man-made event or high probability scenarios that threaten the security of vulnerable populations, so again, vulnerability, right, and unleash potentially damaging phenomena within a given time period and area, okay? So again, what are some types of hazards? This goes along with vulnerability. Some types of hazards, I think these are probably easier to think about. Hurricanes, right, flooding are some natural hazards, and then you have like chemical spills, nuclear disasters, etc. are some quote-unquote man-made hazards. But we're going to talk about, and we're going to spend most of this class talking about how the distinction between those two things is a lot grayer and less defined than you think, than you might have thought previous to this course. Okay, and then finally we have capacity, right? So it's vulnerability plus hazard divided by capacity. Capacity measures the disaster preparedness of a community. It's a continuous and integrated process resulting from a wide range of risk reduction activities and resources rather than a distinct sectoral activity by itself. Okay, so it requires the contribution of many different areas ranging from training and logistics to healthcare, recovery, livelihood, institutional development, etc., right? So capacity is how well can a community respond to a hazard? And that response is going to be in part reflected by how vulnerable the community is, right? So thinking about, for example, Hurricane Maria and how it devastated the island of Puerto Rico, The vulnerable populations are easy to identify. The hazards is the hurricane itself, and then the flood, the subsequent flooding, etc. And the capacity was the ability for Puerto Rico to sustain that damage and then eventually rebound. And so some of the capacity deficiencies, for example, were an outdated or an old electrical grid, which caused a lot of the power on the island to go down. And so that's a capacity building exercise that could and should have been undertaken prior to Hurricane Maria to mitigate the effect of that disaster and perhaps downgrade it from a disaster to something less. Well, that's up for interpretation, okay? So again, we have vulnerability plus hazard divided by capacity equals disaster. We're going to talk about some of those vulnerabilities together, because there are many vulnerabilities, but there are some that are easily identifiable. So again, keep thinking about what some of those vulnerabilities are. Okay, so that's the definition of disaster. Let's talk about the difference, the distinction between an environmental and a natural disaster first, and then we're going to talk about how there really is no distinction. So that sounds very confusing, I understand, but bear with me here. Okay, so defined in the literature and in general society, an environmental disaster is typically defined as a catastrophic event that disrupts the environment, whether it be built or natural, and is the result of human activity. That's the key component, is the result of human activity. So here are some examples, right? An oil spill is an example of an environmental disaster. Pretty easily identifiable an easily identifiable environmental disaster. So you have man-made. The oil wouldn't empty itself into the Gulf unless you had some sort of man-made apparatus there that could result in an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. And that's what this is depicting here, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which we are going to talk about in depth in a couple of days. So here are kind of the groupings that are typically applied to environmental disasters. We have agricultural disasters and industrial disasters, nuclear, biodiversity, meteorological, and then I stuck natural on here because, again, this is a key theme that I'm going to keep hammering home, that natural and environmental disasters, the distinction between the two is eroding, if not already has been eroded. Again, blurring the line between what is man-made and what is natural, okay? Especially with climate change and global warming, which is kind of a man-made thing that affects everything, and we'll talk about that in just a few slides. So let's say, let's give a few examples of environmental disasters, okay? So agricultural environmental disasters, one example is the mismanagement of the Aral Sea, and I'm going to go in depth on that example in just a couple of slides, or the creation and the slow decay of the Salton Sea in Southern California, okay? Some examples of biodiversity environmental disasters include the deforestation of Easter Island, Africanized bees, and various blights like chestnut blight or the emerald ash borer, which is currently afflicting all of the ash trees in the United States and North America, or Dutch elm disease, which eradicated many of American elms in the middle of the 20th century, for example. These are examples of biodiversity environmental disasters. And these are just some depictions of those. So we have I don't know where to put myself. We have the Aral Sea, which I'll talk about in a second. We have the Dust Bowl, is kind of also typically considered an environmental disaster of the agricultural kind, right? We have tree blights and then Africanized bees, right? So these are some depictions of these agricultural and biodiversity environmental disaster examples. So let's talk about the Aral Sea specifically and why this is considered an environmental disaster of the agricultural sense. So the Aral Sea was a large inland sea on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So you can see this greenish outline here is where the Aral Sea used to be. Again, shown here. The Aral Sea is no longer this size, and this is considered an environmental disaster. So the Aral Sea, prior to this disaster, was fed by two rivers, the Sirdarya and the Amudarya, one coming from the south in Uzbekistan and one coming from the north in Kazakhstan. And so now, because the Aral Sea no longer exists, actually, we have the North Aral Sea, which is being fed by the Sirdarya, and the South Aral Sea, which is being fed by the Amudarya. But at one point, they were the same. This was the same, the same sea as recently as 1977, in fact. Okay, so what happened? So there's nowhere to put me. Okay, so in 1977, this was what the Aral Sea looked like from space. Big inland sea, again on the border of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Some USSR-sponsored agricultural projects started to use irrigation. They drew irrigation for crops. These irrigation projects were being fed by rivers that previously were feeding the Aral Sea. So the Amudarya and the Sirdarya, right, which were feeding the Aral Sea. Those rivers were diverted to support irrigation projects in the 1970s, and as a result, the water in the Aral Sea went down. If you're no longer feeding it with water from these rivers, which are now going to support irrigation of farms, then the sea begins to decline. So you can see by 1987, the sea is smaller. By 1998, the sea is significantly smaller. And by 2014, there's basically no Aral Sea left. Okay, so now the sea is currently about 10% of its former size, containing only 10% of its former volume and receiving about 10 times less water. So over time, the sea has been fractured into both a north and a south component. And the north component seems to be doing a bit better recently, very recently. And that's because a dam was built on a river connecting the North Sea to the South Aral Sea in an effort to prevent water from flowing from the North Aral Sea to the South Aral Sea and thereby preserve the water that was already in the North Aral Sea. Okay, so the South Aral Sea has essentially been left to wither on the vine. There are some links here if you would like to go and check out exactly a description of sort of what's going on. So the Aral Sea was once the fourth largest inland body of water, but it's been drying again since the 1970s. And more recently, drought has pushed the entire eastern basin, so this portion over here, into complete aridity for the first time in 600 years due to this diversion of water to these irrigation projects. And so what we can see very clearly here, which is really stark and kind of eerie, is that along the southern edge of the South Aral Sea, there were several fishing communities, actually. It's a big sea, it's a big, fourth largest inland sea, right? And there were several villages and towns that existed simply for fishing in the Aral Sea. And since the sea has dried up, it's essentially left these towns and these seaports to wither on the vine, and they've become these arid, steppe, desert-y type regions. You can see there are camels. These are fishing boats that are now just sort of marooned on land. There's no more port village there. So I forget what the name of the town is. Sorry, I thought I had it in here, but I don't. It's down here somewhere in this region over here. So I will Google it, and if you all are curious, I can give you that information. So I mentioned that in an effort to preserve the North Aral Sea. So again, the South Aral Sea has kind of just been left to dry. But the North Aral Sea, which is in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan itself, after the dissolution of the USSR, of course, and actually more recently in like 2005, 2006, built and then improved a dam at the outlet of the North Aral Sea in an effort to increase the water levels there. So we zoom in. So if we're looking at the North Aral Sea here, we zoom in on the little outlet that connects the North Aral Sea to the South Aral Sea, and then we zoom in even further, you can see that they've essentially constructed this large dam. So the North Aral Sea can be fed by the Sir which is still being somewhat diverted to these irrigation projects. Okay, so that hasn't changed too much, but they've built a dam so that the very little water that does make it to the North Aral Sea doesn't escape necessarily to the South Aral Sea, especially during sort of a flooding event or something. So it's a very controlled dam, and this has actually worked to preserve the size and the amount of water in the North Aral Sea. So this is a great example of an agricultural environmental disaster. Another really great example of an agricultural style natural disaster is the Dust Bowl, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Industrial environmental disasters are probably the most infamous of the types of environmental disasters, right? So we have like Superfund sites, asbestos, the disaster in Bhopal, India, or Minamata disease in Japan, which was a mercury poisoning, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Seveso chemical plant spill in Italy. Okay, these are all examples of industrial environmental disasters. I don't think I have to go over these too much. We are obviously going to spend a lot of time talking about the Deepwater Horizon and Exxon Valdez spills, and this is supposed to be a Z here. So yeah, industrial environmental disasters seem to be the most kind of infamous of the types of environmental disasters. They're the easiest to sort of conceptualize and contextualize, and so we'll be returning to the Deepwater Horizon in detail. There are also these what are termed meteorological environmental disasters. They're disasters that are something that humans did, but it's driven by meteorology and it drives meteorology. So, for example, the London smog event of the 1950s, all the smog from coal factories and power plants, coal-fed factories, caused a really bad smog event in London, which was a combination of the emissions from coal, the soot from coal, combined with unique meteorology of London that created this environmental disaster. Another great example is the environmental disaster that's caused by burning of forest fires in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, both in 1997 and 2005. And these types of events occur repeatedly. And fun fact, actually, for my PhD thesis, I wrote about the 1997 Southeast Asian haze. So if you have questions about it, let me know. But basically what happened is you have all these wildfires. People are burning the tropical forest down. It's creating all this smoke, right? For those of you who live in regions of the world where there are wildfires, whether they be agricultural or in the forests, right? In California, we have lots of wildfires. In the Intermountain West, there are lots of wildfires. In the tropics, there are a lot of wildfires that are mostly man-made. Once that smoke gets up into the atmosphere, it's at the whim of meteorology. And with the Southeast Asian haze events from both 1997 and 2005, the wind and the meteorology carried that haze from the places where it was burning, for example, here on Borneo and Sumatra, all the way across the Indian Ocean. You can see here, this is a map showing where the smoke from these fires went. One of the cities that was particularly afflicted by this event was Singapore, which is kind of situated right in the middle here, and where the air quality is just very, 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 very poor. This has effects on like human health, of course. Also has climate effects, which is what I wrote my PhD thesis about. And here is a little clip, which I actually let me click on it. So here's some drone footage of these Indonesian forest fires. Let's see if I can blow it up. Okay, so very clear. I'm not going to show the whole video, but very clearly you can see they cut down the forest, they burn the forest to return the nutrients from the trees to the soil. So they're eventually going to plant farms. They're going to actually farm oil palms there, and then you can see the haze spreading out, and then it's at the whim of meteorology and the climate. Okay, so this is a type of meteorological environmental disaster. And then we have nuclear environmental disasters, very infamous. Chernobyl, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. There's the HBO special, which I have shown in class before. It's very graphic. I'm gonna gauge where we all are with that and see if that's something that we wanna do. There's the 3 Mile Island disaster, which was here in the United States, in Pennsylvania, and then Fukushima, which is more recent in Japan, right? And that was the result of an earthquake, and then a tsunami, and then a nuclear meltdown. So nuclear environmental disasters are very infamous. There's not many of them, but all of the ones that have happened have been truly devastating, as have all environmental disasters. But nuclear ones are up there on the list of infamous disasters. We will be reading an excerpt from a great book written by Kate Brown, a historian, about Chernobyl, about the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, called A Manual for Survival. I highly recommend the entire book, reading the entire book. If you had interest and time to do so, would highly recommend it. It's a great book. Okay, so those are some environmental disasters. Let's talk about natural disasters and then talk about how they're actually the same thing, kind of. So a natural disaster is, again, a catastrophic event that disrupts the environment, whether it's built or natural, and is caused by quote-unquote naturally occurring forces. So some examples of natural disasters include hurricanes, right? Storm surges from hurricanes, winds from hurricanes, rain from hurricanes. Tornadoes are another example. Droughts, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. And so all of these, with the exception of volcanic eruptions, are typically are natural disasters that I would argue are actually environmental disasters. I think the definition is a bit outdated because of the effects of the Anthropocene and climate change in particular. And I'm going to give an example of this in action as it relates to a recent hurricane, Hurricane Harvey. Case study, Hurricane Harvey. So Hurricane Harvey was a hurricane that affected southeast Texas and southern and western Louisiana in the summer of 2018. And so I pose the question, are some natural disasters, or are all natural disasters, actually caused or exacerbated by human activity? Is there a blurring line between what is natural and what is man-made? And I would argue yes, and I hope that you agree with me after this course. So let's talk about Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey was all over the news. Devastating hurricane, devastating flooding in Houston. Here's a picture depicting the flooding from Houston. What was unusual about this flooding is that it wasn't caused by a storm surge. So usually flooding from hurricanes is caused by storm surge, the ocean being pushed inland due to the force of the hurricane. This flooding was actually caused by rainfall, just straight up excess rainfall. And it was a combination of this hurricane moving very slowly and dumping a ton of rain. How much rain? Well, if we look here at the observations from 4 different sources, from 4 different references, we have from actual stations where they have rain gauge data, and then from 3 satellites, which are using different techniques to kind of give us a spatialized view of the rainfall that occurred. And what we can see is that they all sort of agree that Houston and southeast Texas here, from Galveston up to the Louisiana border, really received a shit ton of rain. That's a scientific term for this amount of rainfall. I saw reports of places in Houston receiving up to 50 inches of rain in 4 days. Okay, and you can see that in the epicenters here of the rainfall, it was as high as 300 millimeters per day, which is like 12 inches of rain per day. 12 inches of rain per day. I'm from LA, where our average annual rainfall for the whole year is 12 inches. And for most places in the country, 12 inches represents several months worth of rainfall. This all fell in 1 day and then 4 days in a row, or 3 or 4 days in a row from any of these locations. So it was a ton of rainfall. I can't stress how much rainfall this really actually was. And so there have been several studies that have been done after Hurricane Harvey, and I misspoke. Hurricane Harvey was in the summer of 2017, not 2018, where they're trying to attribute where all this extreme rainfall from Hurricane Harvey came. And so this is what gets at the root of the proposal that I'm talking about here of combining environmental and natural disasters. Hurricane Harvey is a hurricane, was a hurricane. Hurricanes are naturally forming phenomenon. They would happen with or without us. They have happened before humans, and they will happen after humans. So the existence of Hurricane Harvey is not the environmental disaster part of this, okay? The amount of rainfall that Harvey dumped on Houston is probably influenced by human activity. So this study looked at the rainfall from Hurricane Harvey and attempted to estimate how much rain Hurricane Harvey, the exact same hurricane, would have delivered to Houston had it not occurred during this contemporary period of climate change. So while Hurricane Harvey was still an extreme event on its own, an extreme quote-unquote natural disaster with a low rate of occurrence and a long return interval, new research suggests that global warming may have exacerbated the heavy rainfall from Harvey by up to 20%, okay, and shortened the return interval of such an extreme event by millennia. So what this is saying is that if humans had not caused global warming, Hurricane Harvey would have dumped 20% less rainfall on Houston. Okay? So it's not that it wouldn't have existed, it's that it wouldn't have been nearly as devastating. Also, Hurricane Harvey was a very rare event with a ton of rainfall, as we've mentioned, a very extreme event that we would expect to occur every, oh, I froze again. QuickTime does it. Okay, here we go. So, extreme events are always going to be a part of nature. But we would have expected an extreme event like Hurricane Harvey to occur every several thousand years. But because of climate change, we can now expect a Harvey-type event at much higher frequencies, maybe every decade even. Okay, so we've significantly shortened the return interval of this extreme event. So both the excess rainfall and the likelihood of such an extreme event have been influenced by human-caused climate change, thus making Hurricane Harvey an environmental disaster. And I want us to interrogate this idea together over the course of this semester, because I think that this is a really important distinction, and the reason why I called this class environmental disaster is because I don't believe that there really is such a thing as a natural disaster in the age of climate change, unless we're thinking about volcanoes and earthquakes, which are not influenced by human activity. There are several articles that you can read about Hurricane Harvey, and I encourage you to do so because there may or may not be a question on your quiz about Hurricane Harvey. Okay, so that is our short little lecture on the distinction, the introduction of environmental and natural disasters, and the distinction between the two, and how I would argue that there really is not a distinction between the two. So the group activity that I'm going to ask you to work on later today, is in 4 groups. So I will divide you up into 4 groups. I would like you to explore one of these natural disasters and describe in detail how it is both man-made and natural, how it's both environmental disaster and a natural disaster. I want you to identify the causes of these disasters, the vulnerable populations, the hazards involved, the capacity and disaster preparedness of the afflicted communities, all of the things we talked about in this lecture together. So there are 4 disasters. There's the Fukushima nuclear meltdown, the Southeast Asian smog, the Dust Bowl, and the Great Smog of London, all of which I introduced in this lecture. So I will assign these to the groups after we have the conversation in Zoom, and you will be able to work on these throughout the rest of the day. I'm not expecting much more than like 1 slide's worth of information, which I will then ask you to upload to the Google Drive so that we can all kind of share our thoughts on these tomorrow. Okay, so that is the lecture for today.